I research into protest movements, so I'm particularly interested in autonomous and anarchist protest movements and their use of different communication strategies. And the hook that's normally hung on is kind of digital communications, because that's what people are interested in. But actually I'm just as interested in protesters' use of masks or samba bands or banners or placards or, you know, any other different numbers of ways of communicating. And so, for example, my most recent publication looks at the Black Lives Matter marches that took place last summer just after lockdown was lifting, and looks at the way in which kind of slogans that had circulated through activist digital networks kind of leapt out from activist networks into kind of mutual aid COVID networks. From there onto placards that kind of circulated through the streets in demonstrations on the back of all our Amazon packaging that we'd been using in lockdown, and then went from there actually into people's houses, up into people's windows often. And I thought that raised a whole load of really, really interesting questions about who protest is speaking to. Is it speaking to governments? Is it speaking to journalists? Is it speaking to our neighbours, to the public, whoever that public might be? So my research is really very interested in these questions of how protest speaks. How do protesters speak to each other in coalition movements? How do they speak to journalists, to governments, to the wider public? And then, of course, the flip side of that, which I think we look at a lot less, is how other people listen. How do people hear protesters in different ways? And I think that's actually a really fascinating and underexplored thing. So I've done research around the Long Live South Bank campaign on London's South Bank, and I went into that thinking I'm going to talk to young people, I'm going to talk about their use of digital networks, and I'm going to kind of discover how young people speak. And actually, that isn't what I really ended up doing, because all of those young activists didn't need my kind of help or my kind of insights into how they speak. They're great at speaking. They're some of the most articulate, knowledgeable, adept and nimble people I know. Their speaking wasn't the problem. The problem is, how do policymakers, landowners listen? That was where the block was in communication. And kind of doing this research, I found this kind of technological gap that happens between generations like that, because there was also a kind of huge generational element there where you had a young group of people who had mistakenly been understood as apathetic, as not interested, as just consumers, by an older group of people who saw themselves as having agency and being in control of things. And you had a technological dimension on that as well. So the South Bank Centre were used to dealing with email, with shared Google Docs, with spreadsheets, and the South Bank skaters were used to communicating via YouTube, via Instagram, far more visually, far more verbally. And so the skaters were talking and explaining their position, making their heritage claims really, really clearly, but South Bank Centre just didn't notice. They didn't even follow them on Instagram. They just were oblivious to all of this stuff going on. So this is kind of research that I've been doing for 20 years now, and the research itself has kind of, I have shifted, sadly. I started off young and now I'm old. So I've made that kind of shift myself in different ways. But also the kind of field has shifted. When I began, when I was young, it was kind of quite cool and marginal, and now it's a very mainstream field. There's loads of research happening here, which is really, really exciting. But it also means that the kind of research questions I'm asking are increasingly different. So my new project is kind of looking at how we remember protest. So it kind of asks, what do we remember and how, and what do we forget and why? And I've done a kind of big directive with the Mass Observation Archive. And in terms of thinking about intergenerational protest, I have found it to be such a fascinating thing, because the key thing that it's brought out to me, when you ask people, particularly older activists, but actually still young activists as well, what do you remember? What's your first memory of going to a protest? What they don't say is, oh, it was about this section of this bill, which I felt really passionately about. What they say is, I can't quite remember what the protest is about, but I went with a group of friends and I had a really nice packed lunch and the weather was lovely. So there's this kind of sense that over time, the thing that people remember about protest, it's the wider political context rather than the very, very detailed political context. And it's also thinking about protest as a kind of cultural practice. The way in which protest is a kind of embedded in people's lived experience, both of protest and their lives more widely. And I think for academics, we have got into a habit as academics where we kind of go to the leaders of protest to ask them about a protest movement, and they give us a kind of definitive answer. But when you ask questions more widely, you find that actually there's a huge range of different answers going on there, and so the kind of the information that gets recorded in academic articles is frequently a tiny, tiny slice of things, and what we frequently miss are the younger voices. And more diverse voices, and voices coming from a whole different range of lived experience of protest. And I think that's one of the things that I really, really liked about this project, was this sense that it was kind of open to exploring those kind of intergenerational differences, exploring the way in which protest is experienced by people over a period of time, and how communication passes between generations as well as within protest movements to the outside, to the public, to journalists. And I'm really looking forward to this panel and to hearing exactly some of those lived experience of protests and getting a sense of kind of the range of experiences that are there and that are commonly being missed from academic and popular writing on protest in different ways.